Yes, go ahead. Yes.
I think we've heard across both days some really brilliant ideas about what we think teachers can be doing and the type of training and efforts that we want teachers to undertake or be provided with. And I think we also heard a lot of very well-informed concerns about things like increasing teacher stress and increasing teacher burnout. And I think the reality is that for a lot of teachers, and particularly teachers who are in contexts where things like trauma are higher, they're already burnt out. They're already stressed. They're already overworked. So I was wondering, rather than treating things like burnout or these kind of teacher outcomes as things that we don't want to cause more of, or we just hope don't mess up our wonderful intervention that we've designed, can we integrate ways of assessing teacher outcomes into our research studies to see if the trainings that we're doing are improving these? My guess would be that if we give the teachers the skills to be effective with these hard-to-reach kids, that would improve teacher outcomes as well. And at the very least, if we're not, can we integrate ways to support teachers into these interventions? So I'd like to just hear some thoughts of how we could do that or how you already are doing that.
At Johns Hopkins, we have a longitudinal study that's been going on for 3 decades, and it involves evaluating the outcomes of the Good Behavior Game, which is an intervention that worked with teachers to develop classroom management skills and strategies for first graders in inner city Baltimore public schools. And one of the things that the smart people that started that study did, Shep Kellum and Nick Ialongo, among others, is they asked teachers what was the impact on their experiences of teaching, having been involved in that or not. So classrooms were randomly assigned. Actually, I think whole schools were randomly assigned to get the Good Behavior Game or not. And what they found is that the teachers really enjoyed their work more because they reported being able to spend more time on their own on-task behavior, which is teaching, and a lot less time managing behavioral disruptions among these first and second graders. So I think that's a really fantastic idea and an important point to get a sense of, what is the burden that the educator experiences if we're expecting educators to implement an intervention. And not only what is the potential burden, but what is the potential upside. In my experience, when therapists have implemented evidence-based interventions, they report more enjoyment of their work because they're more confident that they're having an outcome, and actually everybody's confident that they're having an outcome. You wouldn't be a therapist if you didn't think what you were doing worked. But when they were able to see the evidence and get real concrete feedback on that, it improved how they felt about their job. So I think that's an excellent point, and I think it's something that is not especially difficult for us to implement.
I also would add, I'm not sure what the target is anymore in terms of, as a district, what are our performance targets? I likened it, I've actually described it, when you watch archery, and I'll sound bad when I say this, but PDE is holding the target and shaking it and moving it and such, because it has changed over the years. Is our target graduation? Is our target proficiency on Keystones? Is our target PSSA proficiency? It's very challenging. What is the outcome? And this is the first year where our teacher evaluation system is giving us a 3-year average of growth per teacher in a tested subject. I have that data. I got it last week. So I have a coefficient for each teacher who teaches a tested subject, and it gives me a growth factor, a PVAS growth factor. And I can make judgments on that. So I don't know. I liken the PA standards. I actually like the course standards. I think they're logically organized and more rigorous, but 3 years ago we had a 93% proficiency rate on the 8th grade PSSA in reading, and the core line PSSA this year, it's 36% in our school. We actually have some good reforms and initiatives that have occurred over the year, and I liken it to the original PSSA was putting 100 pounds on the bench press, And kids who can bench press 150, that was pretty easy for them. And kids who could barely bench press 100, they could do it, but we're measuring growth. Now they put 200 pounds on the bench press and we all spread out as well. So I've actually backed away from that narrative. We are doing a lot of technical things behind the scenes, but I am just under the assumption in our district that the metrics are not in our favor publicly. So I'm not even engaging in that too much. Instead, I narrowed our focus as a district. I brought it up earlier, the concept of inspiring students and engaging students, and instead recommitting to building trust with parents in our own district rather than worrying about the external metric. So I focused in on the image of the interaction a parent has with a child at home every day after school when the parent says, how was school today? And we know what, or what'd you do today? You know the answers to these questions, but the goal is for our teachers to influence that interaction so that it is more positive. Actually, they were to look at their students where that question would elicit the most negative response and try to influence that in a positive way. Because the metrics, we're still working toward that. I'm not belittling that, but it's not front and center in terms of our narrative, our public narrative. And believe it or not, our community almost appreciates that because some of the some of the mandates are somewhat counter to our local beliefs or values. Now, those standards are necessary because our local standards are too low. That's for sure. But navigating that, I just don't know. So it's a complicated question. So we focused on something much simpler. It has become so complex that we've kind of moved in a different direction. And I think student performance will improve as a result of that. But that is a great question. What is the target? What is the outcome that you're looking for? And I don't have a solid answer for that.
A bothersome part of that is that the target moves because of political pressure, not because of anything that's good for kids. Are you familiar with the International Institute for Restorative Practices? Okay, so out of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, but it's actually out of England. They went into West Philadelphia High School, where the school was in utter chaos. Within a year, the chaos had dropped by 90-some%, and the academic achievement had risen because every adult in the school was taught how to deal with students in a particular empathic way. And every morning, children had circles. Who mentioned that? Yeah. And they got to vent. They got their feelings out. They learned they had more in common than they did differences, and they learned also how to resolve their conflicts through a particular system of conflict resolution. And so the teachers could teach. The students were learning. The violence was gone. And so what did the city do? So as to your question, is there any proof that this kind of thing works? Well, they have videos. They have teachers attesting to the fact that it works. They have data that proves that it works. It works to be kind to people. It works.
So I have a very different response to your question. I'm just going to approach it from a different direction, and that is, as I mentioned to you, in Maryland we have the mandate of the Professional Development School model, and an analysis was done which compared the retention rates for those who had gone through the Professional Development School model with those who had not. And as many of you know, usually within 5 years, less than 50% of teachers are still in the classroom. And what we found in Maryland was utilizing this model, after 5 years, it was almost 90% who were retained in the classroom. That was a very significant change. So why was that? Well, I think it was a number of reasons. One, there are professional development school standards. They're pretty dated, but they're actually still really good. So if you want to look up Maryland PDS standards, you might want to do that. But it focuses on shared responsibility for student achievement. It focuses on professional development, really focuses on faculty being actively engaged in what goes on in schools. That idea that you put a sub-cohort of 5 students, teacher candidates in a school so they support each other, the idea that many of them are hired into those schools, I think also supports that. So they're grown in that program. In our particular program, I can tell you, and again, as a reminder that we focus very much on Title I schools. All of our students have experiences in Title I schools. As we all know, one of the reasons they attribute the high burnout rate for teachers or to teachers is the fact that teachers are typically put in the most challenging classrooms as beginning teachers, and they're not prepared in that way. Arnie Duncan was always talking about that when he was Secretary of Education. So by putting our students in Title I schools with good mentors who've been through our program, where we provide support around trauma, I think that we have been able to respond to that at least somewhat.
Also offer a comment. So, as I made clear from my remarks, what we focus on is, in our work in schools, is not so much an intervention or a program, but rather a process for transforming the culture of a school. And so now that we've sort of developed this process, of course, we wanted to research its effectiveness. And so we've partnered with the American Institutes for Research and are conducting a 2-year demonstration project in 5 Massachusetts schools who are going to do the process that we've laid out in the Volume 2, the Teal book. And AIR is going to measure through quantitative and qualitative measures the transformation of school culture that we hope to see happening in those 5 schools. But what's interesting to me is that when we began working with AIR, we said, well, can you show us the studies where other people have measured this so that we can see, what are the methodologies for measuring the transformation in the school's culture? And they said, well, to be honest with you, we don't really know of any other, research that has really documented this before. So we're kind of figuring this out as we go. I mean, working with very good researchers, so we're fortunate about that. I think that one of the things we've learned from schools, and so we talk about this in our process, is that as much as the data that is generated by outside researchers who are coming into the school, what's also really important from the perspective of culture change is the data that's important to the community of the school. So these are things that can be more anecdotal and observational. And so we had one assistant superintendent in a district that we were working with share a specific example of this in telling us what she meant by saying, you've got to look at the observational data. She said, I was working in a school and, we were doing this work and, the day I knew that it really was taking and that the culture was changing was when I saw Mrs. Smith out on the playground for the first time at recess playing with the kids. She was never out on the playground before. And to that faculty, when they saw her out on the playground, that showed them that, we're starting to turn the corner, the culture's changing. But what research is ever going to capture that? We need to use qualitative measures and ethnographic measures and different ways of capturing these things that are very meaningful, in the school building, but that often, the numbers and the quantitative data don't quite tell us. So.
Yes, right here.
As a school superintendent, I'm curious to know, Jenny, what plans might I expect to hear will be coming out of the Child Maltreatment Solutions Network? You got the big NIH grant, so what can we expect in K-12 to hear shortly within the next, couple weeks, months, or year? And what might I look forward to a year or 2 or 3 down the road?
This is a great question because I'm very much, that grant is very much focused on what we call our research to policy bridge and our forming coalitions that we can take across that bridge. So greasing the skids between what we know from research and what action policy can take, and leveraging some of the changes that are already happening in Pennsylvania to grease those skids even more. I talked about knowing our champions. I know our champions. I know who they are because they wrote me letters, because they liked the way that this grant was framed in terms of impacting policy. So that's going to take even more resources to form the coalitions, and the coalitions like like we've talked about, they're made up of parents, they're made up of educators, they're made up of grassroots front lines people, they're also made up of researchers, they're made up of middle policy makers, they're made up of state and local people coming together, coalescing around a narrative that we can take across the bridge and have briefings. Like what we want are these briefings. To be able to identify the laws that can change, that can reform education, just like some of us in the room have worked on reforming child welfare. It's sort of riding that wave, and I intend to eke every resource out of this crisis that we had at Penn State, and this is part of the crisis. Part of the crisis is that we weren't informed well enough as a community. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know what to recognize, how to recognize things, and we didn't know how to react, right? I intend to eke every resource out of that and every ounce of momentum. So, I can't do it alone. That's why we have faculty that we're hiring, and Carlo is one of those, but also working with champions like Bill here, to be able to say, I'm willing to change that culture in my school, in my community. We've heard it all across this board. It's not going to happen unless there's a change of culture, right? If we use the framework, we have to start with people like Brian, right? We can't do it without that. And it also involves engaging parents and being responsive to the local culture as well. So I think by understanding and partnering with our champions and forming this coalition and identifying the legislators who want to get reelected, what I learned is you look at the people who are going up for reelection because they want to be on that bill. Don't they? They want to be on that bill. So many of our representatives and senators that were reelected were on all these child welfare bills, right? And so those are the people to say, hey, have you thought about this? This is Senator Greenleaf, right? This is Representative Watson. We know who they are. And guess what? They know who we are. Finally, they know who Penn State is. One of the reasons they know is because I learned from you wonderful people that you do work for them. Right? So what did we do for the first 3 years we were here? Well, we went to them and said, what are the problems you need solving? So I'm doing work for the child welfare system I have no business doing. I have no business doing a time study on how caseworkers spend their time, but we're doing it because they need it, because they need the legislation changed to resource the new caseloads as a result of child line calls, right? I've got no business doing it, but I've got faculty now who are building careers, right, working with the statewide data to come up with an algorithm. But that's work for them so that they'll come to us as the experts and say, what do we do? How do we solve this other problem? There's a mandate in Pennsylvania to spend money on child sexual abuse prevention. They actually came to us and said, hey, what's the evidence base say? And I said, slow down. We don't know what it says. And it's not one thing, and it's not just going to be communities or parents. It's going to involve schools. It's going to be media campaigns. It's going to be a thing, but let's do it right, and let's do the research so that if we do it in a few counties like Bill's County, that will do it for us. Then we can mandate, we can mandate line items in the budget of Department of Health, Department of Education, Department of Human Services, and Department of Justice all at the same time, because there's funding in each of those departments if we cobble it together to sustain a $200,000 budget in all 67 counties. So it's going to be stitching all of these things together, but identifying the problems that need solving. And trauma-informed schools is a problem that we've identified that I think we're ready to coalesce around and move it across the bridge. So if you give us a little time, and if you make your voice heard, if you say things like, this will never work, that'll never work, it won't work this way, help us overcome those barriers, then we can do that, because we don't want to go all the way over the bridge and have somebody sitting in the room, I always call it the Donald in the room, is always going to say there's something better to spend money on, right? So equip us with everything we need to know to cross that bridge in a very informed way. And it takes people like you, okay? So that's my answer, but check in. How's that? Can you guys add to that? What advice do you have? What advice?
Well, I mean, just to put a name on what you just laid out, was it's being very strategic. I mean, you sort of have to take your opportunities where they come, I think is a way of saying, another way of saying what you just said. So an example that we used was, we had the chair of our education committee come to us when we had 2 suicides in our state from bullying, and Massachusetts was one of the last states in the country that did not have an anti-bullying law. And so she came to us and said, help me write, give me a memo, help me figure out how to write a bullying law. Well, we didn't know about bullying, but we knew about trauma, and we said, well, gosh, there's a connection here. And what an opportunity to move forward a trauma-sensitive schools agenda by writing an anti-bullying law in a way, and giving her the research that she needed, to be able to do that. And so what we ended up being able to have the opportunity to educate her about was the importance of whole school culture approaches, which are as relevant to bullying as they are to the issue of trauma. And of course, the issues overlap. And what that did was, from that point forward, she had cemented in her consciousness the importance of whole school approaches. And then as the chair of education, she brought that understanding to every bill that came after that. And so that was not an opportunity we went looking for. It was an opportunity that came to us, but we took it and figured out how to fit a square peg in a round hole, and use it as a strategy for moving forward.
When Pennsylvania worked on its anti-bullying law, there were people there who wanted to increase the punitive nature of response. There was a school district lawyer there who wanted it in the bill that the police would talk to the child before the parent was connected. I cannot tell you how harsh it was. There was a member of the House Education Committee who was holding the hearing, and it was all men. There were no women on the hearing from the legislature, who had been bullied as a child, who actually had a tremendous flashback, was rendered into tears, and had to leave the hearing. That's how powerful. And it took us to say to this group of men, who were mostly lawyers, these are children. You're writing legislation about children. It is not our job to criminalize children. And to talk to them about the age where most bullying occurs, according to psychiatrists and psychologists, is elementary school. And they are writing harsh laws that are going to criminalize little kids who are kindergarten to 11, and to have them roll that back, and to have them consider that in every community, the school district ought to have a collection of adults from all ethnicities and cultures to be a part of creating their response to this issue, because bullying doesn't look the same in every culture. And when you see that there's going to be a hearing on something that is of concern to you, your organization needs to call the head of the committee that's holding the hearing and insert your testimony. You have the right to do that, and it's important. I'm not seeing enough variety in who comes to testify. It's the same old group, over and over again about education law. And I'm not seeing child welfare workers in there to advocate for children when these laws are written. And I just encourage you, and you have to watch. I mean, it's onerous. You have to get on a distribution list and see what's coming up, what hearings are coming up, so that you will know when the issues that are of concern to you are being discussed in the legislature, and you need to go in there and teach what's best for kids.
We have one over here, hasn't spoken.
Good afternoon. I am a school social worker morphed into a truancy officer, and I find myself in the audience of teachers frequently. And